Hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Jamie Leigh Kellar will defend her academic thesis, Becoming Pharmacists, Professional Identity Struggles of a Profession in Transition. May I invite you to present a summary of your findings of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Yes, thank you. Dear Pro-Rector, supervisors, and members of the committee, colleagues, friends, and family, both present and online. Over the next 15 minutes, I will give you an overview of the research that I have conducted over the last several years on pharmacist professional identity and its relevance to pharmacy education and practice and the broader health professions education community. To begin, I would like to position myself in relation to my research, as this is important to the rigor of qualitative methodologies which I used throughout my studies. I would like to share with you that I am a pharmacist, educator, researcher, and associate dean at a faculty of pharmacy in Canada. I have come through the pharmacy education and practice systems. Hence, I have been socialized into the profession of pharmacy and would be considered a professional insider. In other words, I have the professional identity of a pharmacist. My position as an insider benefited my research by providing me with familiarity of the profession. However, it also presented challenges, as at times it could cause me to overlook conversations that may have informed different interpretations of the data. To balance out my perspectives, my research team included 3 non-pharmacist health professions researchers to provide alternate views. I would also like to give you a peek into pharmacy in Canada to provide context for my work. There are 10 pharmacy schools across the country, with the Doctor of Pharmacy degree being the entry to practice requirement. There are approximately 33,000 licensed pharmacists in Canada, with the majority of those working in community practice, which is comprised predominantly of corporate chain pharmacies. Pharmacists have expanded scopes of practice, which allow for independent prescribing, administration of vaccinations, and medication review services. The bulk of pharmacy revenue is generated through dispensing services, however. Now, I would like to ask you to take a minute to think about your identity. What is an identity? How is it formed? Simply put, an identity is who we are and who we are seen to be. A professional identity, therefore, is who we are in the context of our chosen profession and how that profession is seen within society. Identities are formed over time. Hence, professional identity formation is often described as the process of transitioning from a lay person into a healthcare provider. Professional identity is not a new concept. It has been of interest to sociologists for decades. It was American sociologist Robert Merton who originally discussed the role of medical education in shaping professional identity in 1957. Merton stated that education should shape the novice into the effective practitioner of medicine, to give him the best available knowledge and skills, and to provide him with a professional identity so that he comes to think, act, and feel like a physician. The latter part of this statement has been reproduced in most health professions publication on identity to date. It was only in 2010, in the Carnegie Foundation report, that the notion of professional identity being given greater emphasis in medical education resurfaced. It has since gained momentum and is now formally being integrated as a main goal of medical and health profession education around the globe. Advocates who are calling for closer attention to professional identity and health professions education presume that agreed upon standards can be established, taught, and learned. Cruz and colleagues, leaders in this area in medicine, state that educators must understand the nature of professional identity formation, and the process of socialization through which a professional identity is formed, so that they can successfully guide students to think, act, and feel like physicians. Although well-intentioned, Cruz's positions suggest that there is one right way for a doctor to think, act, and feel, and that if we inform educators of the recipe then our programs will turn out good, uniform doctors, nurses, or pharmacists. A rather reductionist view of a complex issue. The rapid proliferation of publications on professional identity in health professions, coupled with the lack of empiric data specific to pharmacy, led me to the research in this thesis. Specifically, I was curious about why the profession of pharmacy has been struggling with practice change for close to half a century, despite significant changes to scopes of practice and education that focuses on training pharmacists as healthcare providers. There seemed to be a disconnect between the professional ideals and functions being taught in education versus those that were actually being enacted in practice. I wondered if professional identity could somehow explain some of the complex issues facing the profession. Much of the identity research to date focuses on gaining a better understanding of the psychological and social processes that influence identity. However, more recent work illustrates that identity formation is also heavily shaped by socio-historical and cultural contexts. This line of inquiry intrigued me, as pharmacy is an ancient profession that has been subject to ongoing debate as to whether it's an occupation or a profession for decades. This led me to want to explore the socio-historical roots to get a deeper understanding of professional identity in pharmacy specifically, and how that might actually impact what we're seeing in practice. To this end, I set out to explore the professional discourses, institutionalized norms, ideas, and practices that shape pharmacy learning and practice environments, and thus influence professional identity construction. I approached this thesis in 3 ways. First, I identified how professional identity is discursively framed in pharmacy education and practice via 2 separate studies. In Chapter 2, I examined the North American pharmacy education literature over the last century to uncover the dominant discourses that govern education. And then, in Chapter 4, I examined the international pharmacy practice literature to uncover the discourses that shape practice. In Chapter 3, I explored how the healthcare provider identity became the desired collective identity for the entire profession. And finally, in Chapter 4, I explored the factors that influence how pharmacy students construct their professional identities. The research that makes up this dissertation was undertaken from a critical stance to enable for granted assumptions in pharmacy education and practice to be challenged. The theories of philosopher Michel Foucault informed this work. Specifically, I used Foucauldian-informed critical discourse analysis to dismantle and examine legitimized statements, or truths, about pharmacists over time. This enabled the identification of language and practices that shape and limit the way individuals, pharmacists and students, and institutions, universities, community and hospital pharmacies, can think, act, and speak at different points in time. Foucauldian critical discourse analysis is historical in nature and involves building an archive of text for analysis. It allows us to examine how different discourses construct different versions of the social world. So, in Chapter 2, the first study of this thesis, a Foucauldian critical discourse analysis was undertaken to identify the dominant professional discourses in pharmacy education in North America. 5 unique discourses were identified: apothecary, dispenser, merchandiser, expert advisor, and healthcare provider. Each discourse constructs the pharmacist's professional identities in different ways and makes possible certain language, objects, and subjects. The healthcare provider identity dominated the literature. Hence, it's given significant legitimacy in educational design and delivery. This is evidenced by the proportion of clinical faculty members teaching in our schools, hours of clinical therapeutics content, patient skills courses compared to foundational sciences, and professional events like white coat ceremonies. The healthcare provider closely resembles the identity of medicine. Hence, it's associated with more power than any of the others. An unexpected finding of this study was that the discourses identified didn't shift from one to the next over time, but piled up, resulted in students being exposed to multiple, oftentimes incompatible discourses. The messages that are created and reproduced within the educational systems are that dispensing and business functions in pharmacy are undesirable and not congruent with being a good pharmacist, as evidenced by quotes such as, "The chain drugstore idea has been a potent factor in the destruction of professional ideals and standards in pharmacy." This messaging puts learners at risk for identity dissonance as they navigate the performance of the ideal identity shaped by their educational experience, and then the one that they're frequently called upon to perform during their clinical rotations and as they transition into practice. Chapter 4 presents a scoping review that explored how practicing pharmacists' professional identities are discursively framed in the practice literature globally. 23 studies from 11 different countries were included. 5 major professional discourses were once again identified: clinician, dispenser, business person, patient counselor, and physician supporter. They mapped very closely to the discourses that were identified in the education literature. The dispenser identity was the widest spread, but it was viewed by pharmacists as being undesirable, as evidenced by the following quote: "Dispensing is a mundane task to me." On the other hand, the clinician identity was the most desirable. However, it was viewed by many to be aspirational. It was also felt to be incompatible with the business person identity, as evidenced by a pharmacist who stated, "We're just perhaps seen as businessmen rather than clinicians." This review illustrates that although pharmacists aspire to be clinicians, they do not uniformly perceive themselves as clinicians, and many practice environments have organizational cultures and structures that prohibit the embodiment of this identity. A significant gap exists between the profession's desired identity and the one given the most legitimacy in education and that embodied by practicing pharmacists. Again, the resulting dissonance may be a factor in the slow pace of practice change the profession has been seeking for decades. So why all of the fuss about the healthcare provider identity? Why is it given so much legitimacy? In Chapter 3, we sought to explore these questions. We focused on understanding the social, historical, and professional cultures that allowed the healthcare provider discourse to emerge and thrive. We analyzed texts from the international pharmacy literature that conceptualized the philosophy of pharmaceutical care. We identified an overarching reprofessionalization discourse. The threat of becoming obsolete drove the profession to manufacture a new vision for the future, one grounded in patient-centered clinical functions. It was specific historical and societal changes, such as mass manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, automation, the rise of the internet, and regulation of pharmacy technicians, rather than a natural professional evolution that created the conditions possible for pharmacists to pursue modern-day clinical functions. Pharmaceutical care was positioned as the savior for the profession. It was said that pharmacy is ready to take the final step in the long path back to its former status as a mature profession of major importance in medical care. Pharmacy is at a transition point between one evolutionary stage, the clinical pharmacy movement, and the next, pharmaceutical care, pharmacy's mission for the 1990s. The discourse originated in the United States. However, it gained global recognition rapidly, becoming the philosophy and mission for modern pharmacy practice around the world. Now, having identified multiple discourses that frame professional identity, the final study, Chapter 5, of this thesis investigated how current pharmacy students engaged with the discourses to construct their emerging identities. A single-site case study of fourth-year students from the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Toronto was used. We identified several factors that influence how pharmacy students construct their professional identities, including the path to pharmacy, curriculum, environment, preceptors, and patient interactions. The study found that students had strong internalized healthcare provider identities by their last year of training, illustrating the power of discourse. The students asserted strong rejections to non-healthcare identities when faced with them in their clinical practice sites. This suggests strong socialization processes at work within our curriculum, reinforcing the healthcare provider role and devaluing other common roles such as dispensing and business functions. In addition, there was evidence of a hidden curriculum, particularly as it relates to corporatization. During clinical placements and work experiences, students are exposed to corporate pharmacy models that value quantity over quality and prioritize business and dispensing roles over clinical services. Students felt conflicted as what they were being asked to do was not compatible with their internalized healthcare provider identities. As such, these experiences may unintentionally deter pharmacy students from pursuing community pharmacy practice, where 70% of them will likely end up, which may have significant impact on the pharmacy workforce in the future. A student stated, "I was disillusioned. I felt pressure from management to accomplish certain goals. I wouldn't have felt that pressure in another healthcare profession. It feels like I'm a cog in the machine. I'm a replaceable piece. If I'm unable to meet quota numbers, then my boss can find someone to replace me. It makes me feel underappreciated and undervalued." In closing, I will leave you with some key takeaways from this research. Identities are complex and cannot be fully understood without exploring the socio-historical and cultural context of our institutions and our professions. Professional discourses are powerful governing forces that impact professional identity construction. There is professional identity dissonance that individual pharmacists experience in practice that is rooted in the disconnect between the discourses reinforced and reproduced in our educational settings, our pharmacy schools, and the environments in which pharmacists perform their work. The hidden curriculum significantly impacts identity construction. Professional identity formation should not be a top-down process that dictates who students should be, but rather it is a journey throughout which students construct their own identities under the guidance of our faculty. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to the pro-rector.
Thank you very much for your clear presentation and coherent discourse. And your para-nymphs are now dismissed for standing this whole hour, and the opposition will be opened by Professor Heiligers. He is Professor of Medical Education and Training in the Teaching Hospital, Professor Heiligers, and Secretary of this committee, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, my compliments to you and your team for this very important research, which is also very well written, compact. I like that very much. It was a joy to read, and I learned a lot, especially from the methods you used. My first question is about Chapter 5. In your conclusion, you write, the profession could benefit from curriculum reform. You found, however, two important factors that influence the preferred identity of students. One is the Plan B student that actually wanted to become a physician. And the other one is that a lot of students have no clear idea of what it is to be a pharmacist. So my question is, don't you think that it's better to select pharmacy students in a better way? You want to have the type A students, and to inform potential pharmacy students about their potential future instead of changing the pharmacy curriculum.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you first for the compliments for the thesis and for your questions. You raise an interesting point that certainly I have given a lot of thought to regarding pharmacy admissions, particularly noting that many students land in pharmacy as a Plan B, most wanting to be physicians or wanting to work in healthcare, and pharmacy becomes one of many options, particularly due to the competitive nature of health professions training in Canada, but around the globe at this point. As well, those that wanted to be pharmacists had a very limited view of the profession, and that's actually because their contact as young people with the profession is mostly in corporate chain pharmacies, which present a very different image of what it means to be a pharmacist. So yes, I think probably from an admissions perspective, particularly a recruitment perspective, we could go out and work with individuals younger and really advocate for what pharmacists can do in modern healthcare. And likely that would increase the number of folks that consider and think about pharmacy, and that's work that's certainly being done. The challenge, though, is that I think many people want to be doctors. And I think that's a reality in healthcare broadly speaking for all sorts of reasons, probably grounded in many of the socio and historical contexts about what it means to be a physician and where you land in the healthcare hierarchy. But not everyone can do that. And so pharmacy, being a very close neighbor to medicine, having come from the original roots, socio-historically speaking, becomes an option for many, particularly those with a specific interest in pharmacology and drugs. And so we do get thousands of applicants into our programs across the country. We do get very smart individuals, and we do get those that once they arrive, learn about the profession and are highly committed to it. And so I think admissions can use work, but I think what actually happens within the curriculum is we perpetuate a number of discourses that actually govern what it means to be a pharmacist, and we take a profession that's very broad and through our current curricular maps, narrow it to the only way to be a legitimate pharmacist is to do this. Whereas if we altered the curriculum and recognized and valued multiple ways of being pharmacists, I think we would have a different output on the end.
Thank you very much. My next question is about chapter 4. In the introduction on page 9, you write that professional identities are socially and culturally derived. In chapter 4, you investigated how pharmacists perceived their professional identity. You did an extensive literature search, starting with over 21,000 articles, and finally this was reduced to 23 studies from 11 countries. And on page 77, you write that a strength is that the study has an international focus. However, in all these countries, the social and cultural context is different, of course. So my question is, why didn't you focus on information from one specific country with the same social and cultural context so that the information could be used, for example, to improve the curriculum of pharmacists?
That's a great question as well, and certainly one that I gave a lot of thought to in designing the study. The reality, as you can see from 21,000 possible studies that filtered down to only 23, is that there's not a lot of work done that explores professional identity in pharmacy globally. And so had I narrowed it down to countries that were more aligned with potentially the Canadian culture or a more westernized culture, it would have reduced the sample even further. So that was one of the challenges. But I think the other piece that was really important is that American pharmacy has been very dominant in pharmacy research and publications. And so there's a presence from American pharmacists really globally, and they really impact how curriculum is designed, they impact how pharmacists practice in contemporary society. And so what was interesting by including the 11 different countries, although each sample of countries was very small, was that it reinforced that things like pharmaceutical care, this aspirational healthcare identity and the discourses that surround it are prevalent in all of the studies from the different countries, and that came through in another study as well. And it shows, I think, that there's an appetite for pharmacists to rethink who they are. As a profession, we've been impacted by societal transformations more than others, and so there's this desire to really rethink the profession at this point globally, and I think this study just speaks to some of the globalization of those ideas that were very much started in the United States.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll finish my opponent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Heiligers. The opposition will be continued by Professor Kerstin Janke. She is a professor of pharmaceutical care and health systems at the University of Minnesota College of Pharmacy. Dr. Professor Janke, please, you're online and please ask your question.
Thank you. And thank you, Jamie, for the work that you have done. I wanted to start by asking about some of your goals in conducting this work. You stated in your writing in the introduction that one of your goals was to make visible the historical, political, and institutional power that underpins professional identities and which ones are legitimized and which ones are marginalized. I definitely saw in your work a thread of the historical impacts and influences. I'd like you to tell us more about the political and institutional power structures that you uncovered in your research.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the question. You make an astute observation that much of the work that I present in the thesis talks a lot about the socio-historical and some of the cultural aspects, and less about some of the political pieces that govern the discourses. Part of that, actually, was driven by the challenges of getting my work published. Foucauldian critical discourse analysis, for those that are familiar with it, talks a lot about institutional power and power relations. It's a very critical method that really does require harsh looks at reality and really focuses on challenging the status quo. Pharmacy wasn't quite ready for much of that, as I learned early on, and my work was really difficult to publish when I took a very aggressive stance when it came to being critical and really exposing some of the underlying political factors. As a result, much of my work that you see, particularly in the published pieces, focuses on the socio-historical piece, as that seemed to be more palatable to the current audience. My guess is that I'm one of the first people to explore professional identity as a program of research, not a one-off study in a single school. I'm also one of the first pharmacists to employ Foucauldian methods, and there's very little work in pharmacy that uses a critical stance. And I had to learn how to navigate that as a new researcher, which I will say was one of the biggest challenges. But to still answer your question, the political structures were there. What really has driven pharmacy has to be really clear across the century worth of research, particularly in education, was this desire to get back to being closer to physicians. When Carnegie had Flexner hired, or when Carnegie's published a report, pharmacy followed suit pretty quickly with, well, what can pharmacy do? And when Carnegie didn't want to fund pharmacy-related education research, they looked to the Charters report and a number of other things that I reference. There was a strong movement that if pharmacy got too far from medicine, we wouldn't remain our status as a profession. And those drove a number of the discourses, a number of curricular design, and a number of the statements regarding corporatization of pharmacy as early as the 1930s, yet the chain drugstore didn't become so popular until much later. So the voices in the literature where they had the most power were academics, folks that had a vested interest in keeping pipelines strong, folks that wanted to keep training at a high level, universities that wanted to continue to grow programs. We went from apprenticeship models to full-out entry-level doctor of pharmacy degrees, and in some of our curriculum, very little actually changed between Bachelor of Science degrees. So there was huge academic voices that governed much of this, particularly from large US universities that had very large and influential medical schools. And so much of that was there. It was just hard to get through based on how my studies came out when they were published.
Thank you. I also noted that your initial curiosity in this area was because of our rate of change, our slow rate of change. And I'm wondering if you can describe for us what you now believe to be the influencing factors in that slow rate of change.
Well, that's probably future work for sure. I think what I learned throughout this is I started from that place of practice change. I became a faculty member at a pharmacy where I was trained as a student, and I stood in front of students and kept saying, pharmacy practice is changing. But I had heard that 20 years earlier when I was a student myself, and I was having a hard time making sense of some of those things. So yes, that's where I started, and I wondered, why are we still talking about practice change and some of the same things that we've been talking about when I went to the literature for close to half a century? I now recognize, though, that professional identity is complex, and I do think that it contributes to some of the challenges that we see as a profession, but I don't think it's the solution to some of the challenges we see related to practice change and the pace of change. I think it's one piece of what I've learned is a much more complicated puzzle and requires a lot more depth and uncovering as to what else is contributing to practice change and some of the delays that we've seen. We've changed scope of practice. We've changed education. We've given pharmacists tools to be able to do all of the things that one says they want to do. We've removed barriers, we've facilitated, yet we still don't see pharmaceutical care fully implemented in North America, yet alone around the globe. And I'm curious as to why that is. I think the discourses explain some of it, but at this point I don't have the answers to the rest, but maybe someday I will.
Thank you. And the question next.
Sorry, we couldn't understand you. You're giving me back the words, or? So, okay. Thank you very much for your interventions. The next opposition will be done by Professor Marion Pearson. She is from the University of British Columbia, and she has an expertise in scholarship of teaching and learning. Professor Pearson.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jamie, for a concise presentation and a well-written dissertation. And also, thank you very much for your response to Dr. Yankee's first question, because it helped me understand your attention to the critical part in critical discourse analysis. I was wondering, though, whether maybe instead of or in addition to Foucault, you considered or are familiar with the work of Pierre Bourdieu and the concept of social and cultural reproduction, and whether that might be an alternate framework for the kind of work that you've done.
Thank you for your question. I did consider Bourdieu as a potential option when I was exploring theory to ground my work in. And I think it actually would have worked well and would have shed some new insights that my work doesn't uncover, and as well, maybe some of the similar findings would have come through. But I was really interested in the ability of discourses and the power of words and language to impact what we do. And that started from a very personal place for me when I was hired as a clinician educator. That title had never been used anywhere, and I didn't actually think I was a clinician or an educator, and I was fascinated by why everyone wanted to call me that. I really just thought I was a pharmacist teacher, and that felt okay to me. And so I really specifically became interested in language, and I had a very strong interest in history and pharmacy history specifically for many years. And so working with a number of folks in Toronto from the Wilson Centre, where Foucauldian methodology and tradition is strong, I felt that that was a nice fit to really help frame the work that I was doing. So that's why I landed there, but I think Bourdieu would have been a nice option to explore as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. A specific methodology question related to chapter 3, where you started with 120,000 possible texts and winnowed it down to 50 to use in your analysis. And I'm just wondering what process you used or criteria for selecting the text that you ended up with.
It's a great question. So I started out with the help of a librarian searching for pharmaceutical care. The term is used frequently in pharmacy education. It's a philosophy of practice. Much of PharmD curriculum is grounded in that idea. So that's why 121,000 papers come up. That said, there are a lot of publications that relate to the efficacy, the cost containment, the benefits of pharmaceutical care, and those are actually well stated in titles. And so the titles, with the help of the librarian, we actually screened out to get down to papers that were more likely to look at the conceptualization. I was only interested in how pharmaceutical care was conceptualized as a philosophy. Where did it come from? Why did it become the philosophy of every pharmacy organization around the globe. And so much of that was easy to do from titles. I got down to a much more reasonable number of abstracts, and from there I ended up with 50 full texts for the actual review. And using Foucauldian analysis doesn't require, it's not a systematic review, so I don't need to get every article that talks about the topic. I need to be able to establish stable patterns in the text and the discourse to be able to conclude the discourses and identify them and label them with the help of my team.
Great, thank you very much. Well, and that I think leads into nicely into my next question. And I'm just gonna quote from chapter 1 in your thesis, where you say, pharmacy leaders in education have led each transition with strong vision statements, espousing the pharmacist as the healthcare provider responsible for optimizing medication therapy for patients. So that's pharmaceutical right there. However, these proclamations have largely failed to transform practice. And it made me wonder whether academia actually has the power even to transform practice, and you know, whether in those of us in academia are you know, kidding ourselves about our ability to influence practice as much as we would like.
Thank you for the question. I think that pharmacy education in academia is meant to create idealized visions of what it means to be a pharmacist. And so I'm not finding fault in the visions that have been espoused by pharmacy academics or the desire to transform education and practice. I think those are important goals of academic institutions, broadly speaking, and certainly for health professions and pharmacy education. I think, though, what it highlights is to your point, that education alone can't change practice. And so I think where academics struggle is that we think that by changing the curriculum, by changing the titles that our students graduate with, by increasing the amount of time that they spend with us in our institutions, that somehow just creating skilled, competent pharmacists that we put out into practice will ultimately change practice. What my work, I think, highlights for me particularly is that the organizational culture and structure within the pharmacies where we send our new graduates and our learners to work are so entrenched in profit, remuneration, business functions, that it doesn't necessarily matter what we teach them, because two things seem to happen. They go out into practice, they recognize that what they're being asked to do doesn't align with the internalized healthcare identity that we've so nicely helped them socialize to, and they leave. They pursue other professions. Our attrition is high, and job dissatisfaction is high. Or they stay, and they're re-socialized in the workplace to do what the corporate culture and structure requires that they do. And so I think it's those disconnects between how idealistic academic vision is and the realities of practice that actually create much of the problems that we're seeing. And we need to find a way to actually really call out what's happening in many of our practice sites and really think about how we change those organizational cultures to more reflect what we're trying to do in academic institutions.
Thank you, and I think that's probably my time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Pearson. The opposition will be continued by Professor Ben Janssen. He's an associate professor at the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology at our alma mater. Professor Janssen.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, I really liked reading your book because I think it came to notice maybe we have much in common. Let me explain. I'm a pharmacologist, and I'm struggling with an identity crisis because I was originally a biologist. I did some research. I become an educator. I teach pharmacology. I'm not a clinical doctor. I'm not a pharmacist, but I'm a pharmacologist. And I teach all the medical students. And what happens in daily practice, let me just summarize what happened this morning. I was in a polypharmacy. There was a meeting with all the students, first-line medicine, polypharmacy. Some medical doctors were there, physicians, but also all the students. And I say, well, all the difficult questions, put them to bed, because this is what happens in practice. But then one student said, oh, I really get upset when I see you, because then I notice that I don't know a lot. And each time you make me very uncertain. So I'm struggling with all these different identities, and maybe I need a bit of a Haldol later on if this gets too complicated. But can you help me out? How should I approach and put this all together? Because you're also right in your last chapter. What should these students become? And this does not apply only to the pharmacy students, but also I think the medical students. And my role in helping them is, sometimes I really get confused. So maybe you can reflect a bit on this.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for the question. I think you describe probably what many professionals at some time or other have felt, that notion of identity crisis, or who are we, or where do we fit? And I think from my perspective, thinking about, I use postmodern constructionist theories, is that identities are dynamic and they change over time. They're not necessarily stable, and they actually change depending on who you're interacting with in the social world. And so my identity as a pharmacist in practice is much different than my identity as a pharmacy educator standing in front of students. And those things all coexist within who I am as a human. And so I think our role as educators, helping any health profession trainee, including pharmacy students, is to help them navigate and negotiate the pieces along their education and practice journey that will help them decide the kind of professional they'd like to be. And they then will be able to manage the tensions. And so our job isn't to create a recipe and turn out a number of cookies that all look the same because they're called the same thing, doctor, pharmacist, nurse. It's to understand that they're human beings that come from very different places in the world, particularly when you think about students from underrepresented groups, and they bring with them an identity. And we don't want to crush who they are. We'd actually like that to really lead who they're going to become and lead our professions. And so the key piece for me as an educator is finding opportunities within curriculum and within daily social interactions to help navigate the tensions that they're obviously going to experience as they navigate moving from novice through to expert over time. And that's a journey, as we all know. And so it's not about eliminating multiple identities. It's about embracing multiple ways of being and legitimizing multiple ways of practice and allowing that to be integrated into ourselves.
Yeah, I agree with you. I also like these different identities. But now we're going to practice some. I saw on your last slide, you say you like words. Words have power. That was written there. Well, I have one word. You have been in Amsterdam. Maybe you can read this. Can you try to pronounce it?
Oh, goodness me. My Dutch is not good.
No, I will help you. This is artsenijmengel. This is a term that is written in a pharmacopoeia from 1807 in Amsterdam. Artsenijmengel is a word, I will explain, and arts means physician, medical doctor. Nee comes from the needs, all the needs they need, and arts, and nee can also come from nijver, which means you're very busy, you're a strong worker, and a menger is a mixer. And so this was a term for the pharmacist 200 years ago in Amsterdam. And what they were doing, well, it says it is a medical doctor who works hard, he has all the knowledge, so there are many competences already in this one word, which fits, of course, should be. And what I think there are many of these words throughout the world, not only North Americans, but many other words which show probably already the identity struggles of these doctors, the pharmacists at the time, and I think maybe the pharmacist was there before the medical doctor. I think that's certainly true. And what they wrote in this book, and I want to point out three things, is that they want to unify and legalize all the mixes they had, and they put this in one book so that all the different pharmacists should use the same thing, because they said for the stigma, not all pharmacists are alike, so they would like to have this. Secondly, they were complaining that all the medical doctors, even if they had the same recipe or prescription, they didn't believe in their strength, because doctors do other things with the medicine, and they use it off-label, etc. Maybe the term wasn't existed anything then. And then they also said that the efficacy of all these drugs they were doing should be based on good thinking, which was then maybe not yet academic thinking, but also bedside proof. This was written already in the introduction to the booklet, and they was trying to make one good book and to, maybe to form the medical standard as we have them now. So this is already going on for, at least in Amsterdam, for 200 years, and I think in Germany even more, and so maybe we could even go through all these words, I like that too, and then have a good analysis of all these words, which could also maybe bring more depth in your analysis and how we should learn from the past for becoming a good future pharmacist, doctor, whatever.
I like it. I'll recruit you for my next study to look at words, because I think that is a very nice description of how we need to explore and rethink the use of language and move away from just using words that are common practice, like clinician, which we uniformly use for many, and I don't know that it has as much meaning as the word you've so nicely pronounced and described.
Yes. Thank you very much. I give the word back to the rector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Janssen, and thank you, Mrs. Candidate, for disentangling his identity crisis and some other linguistic discourse. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Marco Antonio de Carvalho Filho. He is professor and head of the medical education research at Groningen University. Professor Carvalho.
Candidate, dear Jamie, I would like to start by congratulating your courage to perform such a research. I can only imagine how difficult it is to challenge common sense and common assumptions in a PhD thesis. So I really congratulate you. Also, I liked your presentation and the discussion until now. I would like to move on with two topics. One is the use of the professional identity formation theory or framework in education. When this discussion started 10 or 15 years ago, I was very enthusiastic about them. I developed, I don't know how many educational strategies based on identity development and identity formation in different medical schools. And now I am progressively becoming a little bit more critical about this idea. And I would love, I already know, but because of what you said, that you also have a critical view on that. So what do you think is the role of this theory in health profession education right now? For what it works and for what it does not work? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for the kind words and the great question. I, too, am probably more skeptical or critical of the professional identity theory, broadly speaking, since completing this thesis. I think that it came out of the professionalism literature and the call in medicine to improve professional behavior, and it's much of it was grounded in this notion of to find a return to the calling of medicine. And when professionalism wasn't enough to maybe achieve those things, professional identity became, I think, the next step of we need to go bigger or think differently about just professional behavior. And so I think professional identity has become a little bit the new professionalism, in that there are a lot of commentaries, there's a lot of theory, and there's been a lot of uptake that this should be the goal of medical education, with not a lot of empiric work to support why, how, what do you actually do with your curriculum. And so what I think it does, having completed this thesis and where I think I sit now, is that I think identity is important. I think it's part of who we are, and a profession is one piece of who we are. I think health professions training should help students think about their identities as individuals and as a person who's now joining a profession. There are shared values and norms that professions have and need to have, that students need to be socialized to and understand. But what I actually think it's doing is really giving a voice to marginalized and underrepresented groups in health professions, because I think by using critical stances and socio-historical theories, you can start to really think about what is the culture of medicine or pharmacy or nursing that is being transmitted. Where did it come from? Why is that still being transmitted, and does it make sense? And does this represent all of the learners that are in our programs that are going to go out and provide care or provide service depending on their roles? And so I think this has opened the door to deeper conversations around what are the dominant cultures that are really driving training in our programs, and much of this will be dependent on the institutions and the countries that they're in. But it provides new language for conversations to challenge how we've always done things, I think, as with all critical work, with the goal of positive social change. Where can we take this? How can we think bigger about what it means to be a healthcare provider in, contemporary society, and what do patients actually need from us? And I think it goes really hand in hand with thinking about interprofessional education. We also talk a lot about that and the intersections between who we are as pharmacists, doctors, nurses, and how do we work together. Well, again, I wonder if, in fact, some of those IPE conversations actually reinforce hierarchies and identities that have existed for years, and they reinforce the status quo instead of challenging it. And so I think it opens up doors for new conversations and hopefully new research that's going to go beyond psychological and socialization theory and to think about these bigger cultural issues.
I agree with you, and I would add that the focus on the individual sometimes can become a kind of foggy thing that prevents us to think of the structure where those individuals are placed. And we give a lot of responsibility to individual process, and sometimes those are structural process, as you showed in chapter 2, 3, and 4. And my second topic, if I still have time, is to explore with you, what do you think is the role of identity dissonance in our educational practices? How can we take advantage of it, and if there is any advantage of it? Because you shared when you were in your acknowledgements, you were saying that you had an identity crisis and probably you experienced some identity dissonance. And I also have experienced identity dissonance in my professional life. And sometimes something good come out of it, I think. But how can we as educators take advantage of those processes of identity dissonance? What do you think?
Thank you for the question. I think actually identity dissonance is an opportunity as well, more than it is a detriment, because I think, again, it opens the door for conversations. And as educators, I think that we are putting our students into different types of work and practice environments as trainees. And they're going to go out and they're going to experience things that are different than what we've taught them through our formal curriculum. And so when they come back, I think we have an opportunity to actually debrief and to work with the learners to help them to learn of their experiences in these different locations. And I think in pharmacy, when we actually do that, what we hear is, well, I went to this pharmacy and I actually didn't spend much time with patients, or I didn't get to be involved in independently prescribing, but I did a lot of counseling and I did a lot of dispensing medicines, but that wasn't what I was expecting and I'm dissatisfied. So how do we leverage that to say, okay, this is one piece of the work, but can you see how it contributes to the well-being of the patient? And I think those opportunities within we need space for that though, and like any curriculum, content drives how we move forward. But I think that the learning actually comes in these richer conversations around the dissonance, the tensions, and really working with students to think about how that can help them develop a stronger sense of who they are and the type of provider they'd like to become as they embark independently on practice in the future.
Thank you very much. I'm very satisfied with your answers. Thank you.
Professor de Carvalho, and the opposition will be continued and ended by Dr. Caroline Zeelbach. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Educational Research and Development at the University of Maastricht. Dr. Zeelbach.
Thank you. Dear candidates, dear Jamie, my compliments and congratulations to you and to your supervisory team on this doctoral thesis. Your thesis offers insight into the development and the discourse around the professional identity construction of pharmacists and the role of healthcare society. Your studies, I think, are very well designed and conducted. In your introduction and also in response to the previous opponent, you described your identity struggle or your own dissonance, which I appreciate quite a bit. You overall discuss your reflexivity, and you also did this very nicely now in the late talk, where you positioned yourself in this research. I specifically value that. You've also described in your thesis that we all have multiple identities that are constantly being socially reinforced, constructed, and reconstructed through the interactions we have. I fully support that idea that professional identities are not rigid or solid, but develop over time and space. And I dare to say that this counts for many of us here present in one way or another. I would like to ask you to reflect on the process of your own identity formation and how it sparked actually your research in your role as clinician, educator, and researchers, and how these various identities have changed throughout the course of your PhD thesis.
Esteemed opponent, first, thank you for the compliments for my work and paying attention to the reflexivity pieces, as they are also very important and something I value as well. And thank you for the question. I think for me, this started as a very personal journey, as I'm sure most mid-career PhDs do. I already had the credentials to work in my field, and so I was practicing as a pharmacist. And for me, the journey started much the same way that some of my students described in my work, in that I actually was from a small town that had a pharmacy but didn't have a hospital, and so I wasn't sure what kind of healthcare provider I wanted to be, and pharmacy made sense. And I had worked in a pharmacy, I had experience, and I thought, you know what, I could do this. And I landed in pharmacy, and then I realized when I got there that hospital pharmacists were a thing, and that hospitals had pharmacies in Canada. And I was able to train in some of those. And what I learned early was that those were very valued within our education system. The only people that stood in front of the room to teach me were hospital pharmacists, or basic scientists that did bench-based research. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to be something in this profession, I need to be one of those. And so I became a hospital pharmacist. And that was interesting. However, I wasn't able to fully enact that clinician that everyone said that I was going to be, that healthcare provider. Yes, I did that. I saw patients, I worked with physicians, it was really great, but I also dispensed medication and filled carts and made sure patients got drugs, which from my perspective was as important as some of the other work that I did. But I didn't understand why that wasn't valued, but only when I somehow made a recommendation that a physician accepted my work was meaningful, yet patients were getting the right drugs every single day, which, as many of us in healthcare know, is not an easy feat. So I started to have these questions. I went back and did another degree in pharmacy and began this work as a clinician educator. And again, that really started to challenge, well, now I'm not a hospital pharmacist. Now I'm in a hospital guiding others, and now I'm teaching classrooms with no formal training. And so when I put all of those things together, I started to recognize that other people had challenges describing who they were and where they fit. And I really was interested in how my identity internally was very much impacted by what people thought, by the roles and functions I was being asked to do and the value placed on those. And that really just led me to thinking about how we use language and how cultures and value are placed on things through curricular design. And all of that led me to Maastricht and to the work that's in this thesis. And I would say now I have a stronger sense that I don't need to have a single identity, that I can be an educator, that I can still practice. I still have a practice license, that I can teach and do research, and there's a place for all of those things, and they will continue to grow and evolve as I continue to grow and evolve as a person and as a pharmacist.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that deliberation. I'd like to tap on something that you mentioned in this reflection, which I appreciate a lot, so thanks for that. I'd like to talk with you about your role as educator, and I believe you rather recently also became the Associate Dean in your local institution. What I'd like to ask you to do is to extrapolate the findings of your research towards the teacher identity formation. Because I believe that the student's identity formation is crucial, but of course we also need to look into the faculty that actually plays a role in there. I'd like to ask you this question from a background of quality assurance or quality management, because I know myself, but we've also known this from the literature, that educators also or perceive different tensions or different struggles in their role with working in academia. So you have the wanting to do research on the one hand, but also wanting to do education. With quality management approaches, those needs and regulations that are in place might support the professional development of teachers, but they might also impair them. So I'd like to ask you to think about what lessons learned you can actually extrapolate from your research on the identity formation of pharmacists to the identity formation of educators.
So thank you for the question. I think it's an excellent question, and certainly there is some literature that explores the educator identities and how one goes about forming those, particularly in health education specifically, for folks that have been clinicians and are also navigating that education research trajectory. And I think one of the things that's really important in thinking about the educator identity, I feel strongly that education is important and as important as research, which is not an easy thing to say coming from the University of Toronto, which is a very research-intensive university. And so I think as a faculty, as an institution, when I think about my own work from a socio-historical and cultural perspective, I think we really need to think about what is the culture of those institutions? How does it translate?
So Jamie Leigh Kellar, the time appointed for your defending your thesis has passed, but if you wanted to ask some discourse to your already excellent answer, it may be allowed if it were to be restricted to one sentence. So what's your answer?
We have work to do in this area.
There you go. So the degree committee, the candidate will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. And I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Thank you.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes. In the meantime, let's take a closer look at Maastricht University's renowned teaching method, problem-based learning. Once the pro-rector reconvenes the session, we'll tune in and continue the live stream.
Problem-based learning, or PBL. What does that mean exactly? 3 of my fellow students and I will show you around.
Every week, we analyze a different case or issue together. We discuss the case and everyone can contribute different perspectives to the group discussion. If we get stuck, our tutor helps us out and suggests what we could do next. I prefer going to the library to prepare. Here, I can focus and I have quick access to books or journals that help me understand the case. Today, I can also train my stitching skills in the Skills Lab, where you can immediately put into practice what you've learned. After a day like this, I like going to the gym to clear my head and get ready for the next day.
At UM, you meet people from all around the world. Hello guys. Some of them are doing their exchange semester here, and they often say that PBL helps them learn and retain things very easily. I can understand why. It's a very active way of learning because you have to bring your own perspective to real-life cases. You have a lot of freedom to manage your time, your studies, your hobbies, and your work. Of course, that also means a lot of responsibility. Right now, for example, I'm arranging my exchange semester in Madrid. How cool is that? In this group session, we're the managers who have to allocate the resources of a real company. This is how we put into practice what we learned this morning. Studying here means being proactive and learning to plan well. Prioritizing and performing well under stress are great skills that help you develop as a person. But now, it's time to grab a coffee at the Student Service Center.
Right now, we're at the Brightlands Camelot campus. Here we can apply knowledge from lectures and tutorials in a practical setting. This helps us understand what we have learned and further develop our lab skills. Today, we're determining the amounts of cholesterol in various products. What I really like is the project periods at the end of each semester, where we complete a full research project. That includes planning, collecting data, analyzing, and presenting the findings. That way we learn how research works and we're able to see what it's like to be a real scientist. After practicals, I have to write a lab report that also helps me process everything I have learned today. UM has a lot of learning spaces where you can work on your own or with other students. This evening, I'm meeting my friends for a movie night organized by the MSP Study Association.
If you study law, you have to read quite a lot. Not all information is relevant, so you learn how to easily find the information you need to solve your case. In the afternoon, I have to give a presentation, so I like to practice it with a fellow student. Later today, a lawyer is giving a lecture. This will help us better understand the case we're working on. Speaking in front of a group is quite exciting the first time round, but you get too used to it quickly. And having to present helps you also to adopt knowledge better. What I like the most is that we sometimes get to enter a plea in front of a real judge. These moot courts are really exciting. Now it's time for drinks with friends. Studying is important, but so is relaxing once in a while.
So I reopen this ceremony. Jamie Leigh Kellar, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. It took some minutes, sorry for that. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. So Professor Oude Egbrink is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I invite your supervisor to now take the floor. Take the floor.
Thank you very much. Jamie, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Jamie Leigh Kellar, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university. Ready yet? So, dear Dr. Kellar, dear Jamie, on behalf of your supervisory team, I would like to congratulate you with this important moment in your career. A search on my computer indicated that your PhD project started somewhere around 2014, I think. You wrote a PhD proposal with the title Defining the Good Pharmacist in the 21st Century. And besides Subin Austin, Andreas Gegenfurtner and I were asked whether we would be willing to act as supervisors. Soon thereafter, however, Andreas left and Kees joined our team. You started a description of your research proposal at that time in the following way, and I will quote parts of it. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. This line from the opening passage of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities eloquently captures the central tension of this famous novel. Yet it also captures the essence of being a pharmacist in North America in the 21st century. The profession of pharmacy is in the midst of a significant transformation. There has never been a better time to be a pharmacist, as opportunity to reconceptualize the role of that of a healthcare provider. Yet, in spite of such opportunity, there has never been a worse time to be a pharmacist, either, as there is considerable tension and ambiguity among pharmacists themselves regarding their new clinical role. Such uncertainty poses challenges related to the formation of a new professional identity. This is the end of the quote. And this proved to be a good and relevant starting point for the studies in your thesis that deals with professional identity struggles of a profession in transition. In your studies, you have explored professional identity formation in pharmacy from a social, historical, and a social, cultural perspective. For this purpose, you used several methods. You performed Foucauldian-informed critical discourse analysis of literature on pharmacy education and pharmaceutical care. You wrote a scoping review on the perception of pharmacists of their professional identity, and you interviewed pharmacy students about factors that influence their professional identity formation. The results are of importance for pharmacy educators and students and for pharmacy professionals. You showed that identity construction is a complex process. You uncovered several professional discourses, with the healthcare provider identity being the one that is put forward most prominently in the current education. This can lead to identity tensions, because the dissonance between the ideal, most valued identity and the actual roles in pharmacy practice can be an opportunity, but also a potential threat for the profession. This is an important message for education programs and for pharmacy practice. And your work already attracts a lot of attention. The study described in Chapter 2 was awarded with the Rufus A. Lyman Award for the best pharmacy education paper in 2020 in the American Journal of Pharmaceutical Education. And you are invited to present your work at various conferences. And also of great value is the fact that in your job as educator, researcher, and associate dean, you are able to translate your research findings to educational practice. So altogether, we expect your work to have real impact. Now, finally, your PhD project has come to an end. Kees and I admire you for your motivation and your perseverance. You knew exactly what you wanted. You are not just a fast talker, but also a fast thinker. The analysis that you performed for your first studies, going back in the literature over the past century, took a lot of time and energy. Foucauldian-informed critical discourse analysis was new to me, at least, and we have learned a lot from you in that respect. We also noticed that you had a lot of support from numerous colleagues at your workplace in Canada, which appeared to be very helpful. And thank you a lot for that. Besides being a pharmacist, a researcher and educator, you are also a mother and a family member with ups and downs that come with that. This combination of identities made working on this project sometimes complicated, but you always went on, kept us active, which is a great achievement. Dear Jamie, you have written an impressive thesis that will prove to be important for pharmacy education and practice. Now you can relax a little and enjoy this day. I would like to congratulate your family, present here and also online, I expect, your colleagues and your friends with your significant achievements today and over the last years. I would also like to thank the opponents that participated in this ceremony, online and on-site, even at very early time points, for your judgment, your questions, and the discussion. Jamie, thank you very much for our collaboration. It was a real pleasure to work with you, and hopefully we will meet again at conferences and maybe in Canada or in Maastricht in the near future. Congratulations.
So, dear Dr. Kellar, also on behalf of the Maastricht University, I congratulate you on the degree that you have acquired. And I hope, young doctor, that the discourse of this profession's transition will be promoted by your work in future days. You burdened yourself with Foucauldian methodology, but it fully aligns, as I noticed during this ceremony, perfectly with your aspirations as a mid-career professional. So after some announcements about logistics, I will close this session in a minute. The first two is we like to take a lot of pictures at Maastricht University. So first we're going to take a picture with you here and the degree committee and the online opponents greatly visible on a very big screen. So this will be a great photo. Then we go for the second picture at the stairs of this building. And then I gathered that there is a small reception or function at the Refter and in the remaining part of this building. So I think normally we send all people out to go to the Refter, but in this case I decided that you remain here and that we all go together to the things that you offer us. And with these words I conclude this ceremony.